Hey, let's talk about talking. Video games have pretty terrible dialogue. You can write decent dialogue for a video game if you have a linear story, because you'll know where the player is, you'll know what the characters are doing. You'll be able to write whatever you want, and they can say something like, "As I live and breathe, Gordon Freeman. In the past 12 years, here are the bullet points of the things you missed." And sure, you can write those stories. The powerful thing about this sort of narrative is that you can write really strong contexts into the narrative. So you're not just randomly wandering across someone. There's been a monster chasing you and you just escaped from it, or you've rescued this person from certain death, or they're drugged and they're on their last words, or whatever, right? By writing powerful contexts into the linear story, you give yourself an opportunity to write good dialogue. That's something that doesn't work if your characters are not part of that core story. And this is becoming very common, especially with open world games, right? There are a ton of background characters. Hi, we're generated background characters. We have unique appearances, but we don't have anything to say or do because there's no context for us. So if you try and talk to these characters, what happens? Well, they'll tell you something generic about the overall context of the game, like, "Thanks for saving us from the Reapers." Great. That's not good enough for me, because I have just told the game that I'm interested in this character. I've just volunteered to hear a story about this specific character. That's a hell of a thing for the game to just say no about. That's the player wanting to hear a story is the number one thing that makes that story good or bad in the player's eyes. So saying no, that's a huge missed opportunity, and most devs know that, which is why the generic characters are barely talk-toable, if at all, and there are instead some characters with custom visuals that are really, really obvious, so you know that they have special things to say. And just in case you missed them, we're going to put a glowing highlight around them, and we're going to put an exclamation point over their head, and we're going to mark them on your map. And then we're just going to have giant floating arrows saying, "Talk to this guy, this person here. We want you to talk to this person. This one is the one that matters. Please don't talk to these people. They're just background noise. Stop talking to those people. Talk to this person, this person." Fine, I get it. He's the person that you wrote the dialogue for. He's the person that's actually got the side quest or whatever. I get it. But I don't like him, and you're forcing me to hear his story. I mean, yeah, it's optional, but there's no such thing as an optional side quest. You know that. So yeah, I'm going to talk to him. I'm going to hear his story. And I don't like him. I don't like his story. It's not going to go well. Example of that in Mass Effect. I believe Mass Effect 2. There's a character called, I believe, Werner, and he is your greatest fan. And here's the thing. He is the most generic, worthless-looking dude. I didn't even realize that he was a task character. I thought he was a background character for the longest time. And then I finally said, oh, this person's like actually got a side quest. I guess I should talk to him. But I don't like him. I really hope this side quest is nothing. I hope that it's just like, here's some cash or whatever. Because I do not want to hear about this boring-ass dude's life. And the game is like, oh my gosh, I have a boring-ass dude life. And I want to hear your opinion on it. And I'm like, oh my god. This is the worst. You forced me to listen to this guy's story, and you're trying to pretend that I care about him. I'm supposed to tell him whether to be more badass or less badass, and I'm supposed to care? I don't care. I have a hard time deciding because I actively don't care whether this person lives or dies. They're not going to be a badass, I know that. And if I tell them not to be a badass, I also don't care. Either way, they're just going to vanish from my memory tomorrow. But the game thinks I care, and the game tells the story as if I care, and it just gets more boring when he comes back later and they try and follow up on the choice you made that you didn't care about the first time. You certainly don't care about it now. And that's a small but critical difference. Once you start to add in people that you should talk to, you're adding in something where the player doesn't really have the option to ignore these people. It's no longer a situation where the player is volunteering to hear this person's story. It's now a situation where the player is being forced to hear this person's story. Now, Mass Effect is fully voiced. But if we imagine this was something that was an indie text-based game, there's no reason why it would have to be that specific person in that specific place at that specific time. There's no context there that is important. It's very generic. So, about an hour and a half earlier, I was wandering through the Citadel, and there was a very strangely dressed character, one of those blue ladies. And I was like, this person has got to be a quest giver because they are dressed super weird. So I was like, hey, what have you got to tell me? And she was like, I don't have any lines. She was a generic character dressed like that? Okay. That's kind of a missed opportunity, because if it had been text-based, it would have been possible for her to respond with, oh my god, it's Shepard, I'm your biggest fan. And you know what? I would have actually cared about what would happen to her. I would have actually really worried about whether or not I should tell her to, play it safe or to go be a hero. That would have really made me a lot more interested in the story, because this character is someone that I was interested in. I thought they were dressed dumb, and that's enough for me to want to know more about them. And the game could have taken this opportunity to tell me a story from their perspective. Now, that's still a pretty shitty context. Talking to someone who's randomly walking by is inherently low context. There's nothing about that is high pressure enough for the dialogue to sparkle. It's going to be extremely difficult to make dialogue that really feels good in a situation where the player is just randomly talking to someone. So let's talk about emergent context, because there are a lot of examples of emergent context. For example, in Skyrim, I know, I always talk about Skyrim, there is a shopkeeper, and the shopkeeper's like, hey, come buy my stuff. And you're like, okay, I'll come buy your stuff. And you're looking down at their stuff, and you're like, And then the shopkeeper's like, hey, fuck you. And you're like, what? So what's going on? Well, the thing is that it's very easy to accidentally swipe shit, and then you're in trouble. That is a story that you are volunteering to hear about. But just like me volunteering to hear about my biggest fan's story, it's probably not the story you actually want to be part of. So the hey, fuck you is a preemptive way to tell you that you are on the edge of committing to a story that you probably don't want to be telling. It also makes sure you understand that if he's not looking, maybe you can take stuff. Once you do take stuff and the guard comes by and is like, hey, you just took stuff. Why'd you do that? You got to give it back and pay a cash fine. That's fine too. The fine is low. The penalty is low. The guards they ask questions first. They don't kill you. These are ablative contexts. They allow you to back out of a story that you didn't actually want to be part of. Similarly, there is a samurai game where it's really easy to accidentally swing your sword at people, and you're like, oh no, I just accidentally stabbed that person, and I did not mean to. And the person's like, I got stabbed. And they either run away or they draw their own sword and fight you back. And you're like, oh no, I did not mean to just stab the guard captain. I was just in sword mode and I forgot to switch back to social mode. My bad. And the devs are like, yeah, we understand that. So that's why we gave you a dedicated apologize button. And I think that's brilliant, because the dedicated apologize button means that you can use this multi-purpose interaction to change the context of almost any situation without having to write custom dialogue for it. And there are times in the game where you're going to apologize, and it's not going to be because you stabbed someone on accident. It's going to be because you need to make amends or something similar. Either way, these are ablative contexts. There are also contexts that are not ablative. Like, if you keep stealing shit, eventually you're gonna get attacked by thugs, and it's gonna be like, I know you stole my shit. That's the next step in the Dark Brotherhood storyline, or the Thieves Guild storyline, whatever you want to call it, right? And then there's like a Thieves Guild dude, and he's like, you're stealing a lot of shit. You should probably come and pay us, and then we'll fence your shit. That's all an emergent story in that you choose when to steal, what to steal, where to steal, if you want to steal at all. And once you've done it and committed to it, the game feels okay at unrolling much more aggressive contexts. You're like, Dumpty Dumpty Dum, I'm going to wander through the woods and pick flowers. And then it's like, we're like 10 bandits and we're going to attack you. And you're like, oh shit, well, I mean, this is a world where bandits do attack you. And they're like, yeah, we're going to attack you because you stole shit. And you're like, oh, I did sign up for that story, didn't I? Good call, game. Yep, this context matters. This is something that actually matters. And similarly, when this guy's like, yeah, dude, you gotta pay us some cash. You're like, yeah, okay, fair enough. I signed up for this. It's telling you a story, a linear story, within an open world. And the contexts can be made punchier because the game is allowed to push you. The game is allowed to force your position or your response. It's allowed to suddenly dump you into combat. This is quite a bit different from a game where you randomly walk up to someone and say, hey, what's going on? Because there is no context here. This is just two people randomly hanging out. Can we make some better context? Because having good context is the key to having good dialogue. And no matter how many cool side stories we write, the player can always ask for another one. There are an unlimited number of characters. We really need to figure out how to create good context and use that to springboard into some kind of mission or objective or something. How does that work? Well, I think that there are roughly 10 billion ways to do it, but the important part is that you try. The important part is that this is part of your game. If you're going to randomly generate characters, maybe think about what happens when you talk to those randomly generated characters. If you play Caves of Cud, they just have generic things to say. But the generic things to say are informative. They're like, this location is such and such, or I eat slugs, or we don't like the people with the red fur, or whatever, right? They all have something to say. It's not really high context, but it comments on the overall context of the game. Can we punch it up so that in a game like that, if we talk to someone, there is high context? How would we do that? Well, we'd probably have to use constraints. One constraint might be that the characters inflict their backstories on you when you talk to them. So, for example, if you're playing a hacker game and there's a whole bunch of interesting looking characters being generated in the background, just random city characters, and they're talking to each other, and you're like, oh, those people look interesting, and I am the most generic character that has ever been in any game, so they're definitely more interesting than me. Let's look them up. Oh, look, here's an interesting thing about them. Here's an interesting thing about them. But there's nothing else, right? The game just stops there. What if instead, when you said, oh, let's look them up, it went, and then suddenly you are playing through their lives via how they left messages on their own cell phone. You are making choices in their past. You signed up to hear their story, and here you are, living it in a kind of a dream sequence sort of thing. That would make the game more interesting. You volunteered to hear this story. And so whether or not the story is scripted or randomly generated or emergent, there's always going to be this thing where you're willing to forgive any flaws because you signed up to hear it. You thought this person looked interesting, and now here they are, being interesting. Another option is to reverse that. So instead of having some kind of magical situation where the context suddenly radically changes whenever you click on someone, make it so that you can't click on someone until there is a context worth discussing. So when you're in the city proper, you can't really talk to anybody. There's something about the game's situation where you are not able to talk to random people in the city. Maybe it's because they all speak English and you only speak Japanese. Maybe it's because you're a ghost. Maybe it's because you're on the run from a monster and you're like, oh my God, there's a monster. And the monster's like, ah, and you're not going to go, oh, and by the way, let me talk to you. Man, that's not going to happen. You're in a hurry. So by making it so that there is a context that prevents you from communicating, you can have it so that the characters that aren't worth communicating with, you can't communicate with them. Their contexts are too shallow, but you've given an excuse why you shouldn't even try to communicate with them. And then when you get to some place where you can communicate with characters, there's going to be a strong context. For example, let's say it's a zombie survival game, and you go into the zombie survival hut. And it's full of randomly generated people or whatever, right? But here's the thing. The zombie survival hut is a pretty heavy piece of context. Anyone inside the zombie survival hut, when you talk to them, you're going to be talking zombie survival hut things. So it's worth keeping in mind that you can make high context situations and still have randomly generated characters. And in doing so, you can have those randomly generated characters have very, very, very specific things to say and very specific ways to say those things. And you can write dialogue with subtext and nuance for random characters as long as you understand the context that they're in and as long as that context has some real bite to it. Now, I think there's roughly a million more things I want to say on this topic, but this is already a pretty long video, and I think I've said enough to get a little bit of grounding at least. So if you disagree, let me know. If you have some examples that you've seen, let me know. This is all about not just writing good dialogue, but creating contexts in which random characters can have good dialogue. And that's not something we discuss enough. So feel free to discuss it below. Where's my stop button?